Today, we're not looking at another missing person case, and we're not doing any kind of paranormal investigation videos, anything like that. Today, we're looking into the serial killer, Robert Leroy Anderson, better known as the Duct Tape Killer. Now, once we get into this case and you guys can see what this guy did, you guys will have a better understanding of just how messed up this guy really was. Again, I do travel to some of the areas that were important to this case, and I think it really helps you guys as an audience get a better view of the story. So with that being said, let's get into it. On August 27th, 1994, Larisa Dumansky was getting off of her night shift job at the John Moran meatpacking plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. She just gotten off the night shift and she left the building and just disappeared. Now, her husband, Bill Dumansky, was at home getting ready for work whenever he realized that his wife had actually never came home last night. So Bill drove through the town looking for where his wife could have ended up whenever he found her car at the meatpacking plant. And right away he had noticed something kind of odd was that her tires were flattened, but it wasn't too odd, mainly because months, and I mean months leading up to her disappearance, she was experiencing a lot of flat tires, which is going to be something that you're going to want to remember. But another strange thing that Bill realized was that her keys were still hanging in the door. Behind me is the Smithfield factory here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, that used to be the John Moran factory, where serial killer Robert Leroy Anderson, otherwise known as the Duct Tape Killer, stalked and abducted Larisa Dumansky. I might have gotten that name wrong. And they'd actually worked together. And this is actually the location where it happened. Immediately after finding his wife's car in such a weird way, Bill called the police department. Whenever the police arrived, they actually blamed Bill for her disappearance, blaming that supposedly they had a bad marriage and they had some sort of a fight. Bill said that's not the case because they were not in fact fighting. They had a happy marriage, and she was a few weeks pregnant at the time, actually. Soon after realizing that Bill might have been telling the truth, the police ended up looking at another co-worker of Dumansky's, and he was on a work release program from the jail, and often Larisa would give him a ride back to jail at the end of their shift. On this night, however, the coworker claims that he looked for Larisa Dumansky, but whenever he couldn't find her, he actually hitched a ride with another coworker. The police looked into it, and his alibi did in fact check out. The police did look into a few other leads, but not too long after this, the case went cold, and it had been some time before we had any kind of a break in this case. On the morning of July 29th, 1996, so 2 years after Larisa Dumansky went missing, Piper Streyle, who was 28 at the time, was getting herself and her kids ready for the day. Her husband, Vance, who was 29 at the time, had already left early that morning at 6:30 a.m. to go to a plumbing job he had in the city, and he left Piper alone with the kids to get herself ready and then drop the kids off and then get herself to work. But once Vance got off work that evening, he went to the babysitter to pick up his children to find out that they had actually never made it into the daycare. And he called his wife at their home phone, because this was the 90s. People didn't really have cell phones. But he left a voicemail message on their answering machine that asked, "Honey, where are you?" And sadly, that was a question that will never be answered. At around 3 p.m. that evening, a co-worker of Piper Streyle's, Patty Sinclair, had called her house because she was concerned that it was not like Piper not to show up to work or not, call ahead to let her know something was going on. So she got concerned, called the house, and was really surprised whenever the 3-year-old daughter of Piper and Vance, Shayna Streyle, answered the phone. I'm going to read this right off the screen because I don't want to mess up anything that was said in this conversation. Sinclair asked the girl, "Is your mom home?" "No," Shayna said softly. The little girl informed Patty Sinclair that she and her brother were alone in the house. Sinclair asked where her parents were, to which she replied, "They're probably killed." The little girl hung up the phone. After Shayna hung up the phone, Patty, in a very worried state as you would be, informed one of her coworkers to call 911, and then she immediately called Shayna back, and she stayed on the phone with Shayna for around 45 minutes until police officers were able to make it out to that location to be with the children. Another thing that Patty Sinclair had mentioned was how on the second phone call, young Shayna was in such a hysterical crying fit, as you would be once you know a little bit more about what happened, that she said, "I don't want my mommy to die." The toddler sobbed into the phone, "and I don't want my daddy to die." It's going to get a lot darker. Now, whenever the police had arrived at the Streyle property and went inside, they saw that Piper's purse was upside down. It looked like it had been gone through, dumped out, and they found the two children, Shayna and Nathan, in the house. They were pretty much like hiding, but Shayna was sobbing uncontrollably, and the younger brother Nathan was completely silent. Now, the police did talk to Shayna more after this, and they got quite a bit of information out of her. She had said that early that morning, the mean man showed up at their house. He fired a gun. He drove a black vehicle with black wheels, and he was fighting with their mom. Whenever the mother, Piper, told her kids to run and hide, the mean man also took Nathan's blue tent, which was given to him the day before for his birthday. Neighbors recall seeing a black utility truck in the area, and another couple that lived in the area remember seeing a young man in blue jeans and a baseball cap walking nervously around the driveway of the Streyle residence, and he was walking up to a blue Ford Bronco. And this is another thing you're going to want to remember going forward. Now, Vance Streyle actually remembered something that night. Once he heard the description of the vehicle that the couple had seen, that blue Ford Bronco, he remembered that 3 days prior, a man had stopped out at their residence at around 7:30 a.m., and he was inquiring about the Bible camp that him and his wife, Piper, ran. He claimed that he was looking to get his children enrolled. Again, something important to remember. And from this, Vance was actually able to give the police a better description of the man they were looking for. He described him as in his late 20s, balding, chubby, white male. So this was actually a good thing going forward into this case. Some of the notable things that Vance remembered about this interaction: Vance Streyle remembered that the man's handshake was very limp, and that he actually seemed very surprised that Vance was there at all. He almost seemed like he didn't know what to say whenever he came upon Vance at the location, but eventually he would mumble out a few questions about the family's Bible camp, which right away seemed very suspicious to Vance. Now, even though with all this information that they had on the description of the guy, the only thing that was actually ever found at the residence was a 9mm bullet casing in the driveway, but that was literally the only thing that the abductor had left on the property. Now, on July 30th, 1996, the investigators were able to fully identify the Streyle's strange visitor as one Robert Leroy Anderson, a 26-year-old high school dropout who worked night shift at the John Morrell meatpacking factory in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. He had been married twice, he had 4 kids, and he owned a blue Ford Bronco. Whenever the police took him in for a 7-hour-long interrogation, he wore a baseball cap, a t-shirt, and blue jeans. Anderson, right away in this interrogation, denied having anything to do with Piper Streyle's disappearance, and he claimed that he was not in the area, only to backpedal once the investigators pushed him a little bit, stating that the neighbors had seen him in the area. To which he said, "Yeah, I came to see about using the Streyle's archery range, but when I got there, no one was home, there were no vehicles, so I left immediately." Which, again, the officers immediately tell him, but there was a vehicle there all day. He says, yeah, that's what I meant, but when I knocked on the door, nobody answered. So, again, now he backpedals once more, saying that, oh, I showed up, but then I just left and never even got out of the car. Now it's, well, I came and knocked on the door. And he claims next that, but I didn't hear anybody inside, so I left. And they keep pushing him, and he keeps backpedaling. One of the biggest mistakes he had said is that I heard on the media, on the news, that the Streyle kids were home, but when I was there, I didn't see any kids. There's red flags flying up all over due to this guy just being a complete and total moron, and just, of course, an evil person. So as you can imagine, soon after this interview, they issued a warrant for his arrest, and on August 2nd, 1996, he was arrested. After his arrest, a team of investigators went to his home. They found a pair of jeans that had blood and semen in them. They went through his vehicle. So I'm going to read this word for word, what I had written here, because I don't want to gloss over anything that is important to the case. I want you guys to know exactly what they found in his blue Ford Bronco. It says here, investigators searched his blue Ford Bronco, peeling back carpet to reveal plywood platforms with holes drilled into it for ankle and wrist restraints. They found a toolbox filled with torture devices and duct tape, a dirt-covered shovel, dog hairs matching the Stryley's family pet, traces of black water-based paint, and a pair of human hairs on the floor of the back of the vehicle, which would later be confirmed by DNA to match Piper Streyle. And the water-soluble paint is a very important thing, because if you remember, neighbors claimed to have seen a flatbed or a black work vehicle was actually this vehicle, thanks to this water-soluble paint. Both Shayna and Vance Streyle were brought in to do a lineup to see if they could identify the man that was both at their house 3 days prior to the abduction, and to see if young Shayna could identify the man that she saw the day she was abducted. And in separate lineups, they both identified Robert Leroy Anderson. Now, I do want to read you a list of things that they found while looking for Piper Streyle. It says here, despite extensive search efforts along the Big Sioux River, all that was found of Piper Streyle were two halves of her shirt found in separate locations, a clump of duct tape with more of Stryley's hair attached to it, as well as a rope, chain, eye bolts, a vibrator, and half a burnt candle. It was assumed by investigators that these items were used to torture Streyle. Piper Stryley's body was never found. An interesting thing about the whole case, one of the reasons that he's called the duct tape killer is because a piece of that duct tape that was ripped off and used on Piper Streyle matched exactly, like the cutout and everything lined up perfectly with a piece of duct tape that was found, or the roll of duct tape that was found in Anderson's car. This case is actually about to get a little more strange, because eventually a man named Glenn Marcus Walker, a childhood friend of Robert Leroy Anderson, came forward to admit that he had actually helped Robert Leroy Anderson in the abduction of Larisa Dumansky, and he actually would provide officers with the location of where both of them disposed of her body. And it says here, Walker said they then drove her to Lake Vermilion. When they arrived, Anderson tortured Larisa Dumansky and raped her several times, eventually suffocating and killing her. Walker claimed only to watch and confessed, helping Anderson methodically plan and carry out Larisa Dumansky's kidnapping, but remained adamant of his innocence regarding the rape and murder. So first off, what a pile of crap this person is to entertain these ridiculous ideas of Robert Leroy Anderson and then to actually follow through with it. Obviously, we know Robert Leroy Anderson is also a piece of shit. Going on to say that, I went to the Lake Vermilion. I filmed the area, and I will share that with you now. First, apologize for the wind. We are at the Lake Vermilion here in Canastota, South Dakota. This is the only Lake Vermilion I can actually find in South Dakota. I've heard people say that they actually think it's in Vermilion, but the only one I'm finding here is in Canastota, which would be where Larisa Dumansky's remains were actually disposed of and found, what was left of her. This is also the small town that Piper Streyle, sorry, that's why I got her, lived. So yeah, I kind of wanted to come out here and film a little bit so you guys have an idea what that looked like. In fact, when we first come in here, it's a lot more wooded area back in that area. Like I said, it doesn't really specify exactly where she was found, but this is the area. So, one of the things you guys got to remember is Piper Streyle was never actually found. So it's possible that her remains are still out here somewhere. It's kind of crazy to think about the terrible shit this guy did. I mean, I understand why he did it here. It's the most tree cover in the whole area so far. Yeah. Anyways, I'll film some more area like back here. Lake Vermilion. I'll get out of the shot for you guys. I'm guessing all these houses and stuff weren't here back then. Another break in the whole duct tape killer case would come when Robert Leroy Anderson's cellmate, Jeremy Bruner, contacted the Attorney General's office with information. He claimed that Robert Leroy Anderson was bragging multiple times since they were cellies, telling him about how he abducted Larisa Dumansky and how he abducted Piper Streyle and what he did to them and what he did to, supposedly, he says that after he tortured and murdered Piper Streyle, he dumped her body in the Big Sioux River. Since her body was never found, some people do believe that she might have also been buried out in that Lake Vermilion area, because they are both in Canastota. Piper Streyle was from Canastota, where she was abducted. It goes even further, because Robert Leroy Anderson told his cellmate that at his mother's house he kept trophies of his victims. Bruner told investigators that Leroy Anderson told him where he had kept some trophies from his victims. And it says here that Anderson told Bruner the precise location of where he hid his trophies of his victims, in the basement between the ceiling and the walls of his mother's house. He had also confided in Bruner that he had moved half of Larisa Dumansky's body, keeping a few of her bones as a prize and a part of her skull to prevent investigators from identifying her. Bruner claimed that Anderson bragged about raping and torturing both women, and he said that he disposed of Piper Streyle's body in the Big Sioux River although her body has never been found. Bruner said that the reason people kept seeing Robert Leroy Anderson around the area, why he kept going back that day, was because in the struggle with Piper Streyle, she was fighting so hard that his watch had actually come off, and he went back to look for it. And that's why everybody saw him that day. And after Bruner told the authorities about the trophies in Anderson's mother's house, investigators did in fact find bones, jewelry, and clothing of the two women. Now, two women, both terribly tragic stories. They both lost their lives. And there's one more story I want to share with you guys that doesn't get covered very often in this reporting of this story. I've listened to other people's podcasts, I've read a bunch of stuff, and this is a part that a lot of people don't talk about. And that's the story of Amy Anderson. Amy Anderson was driving by Sioux Falls T area when she got passed by a vehicle driven by Robert Leroy Anderson. They did kind of a cat and mouse game where he would pass her, and then she was like, okay, and he'd slow down so she'd pass him. And, you know, she thought, okay, this is kind of funny, but it's also kind of weird. What's this guy doing? And once, again, he passes her, she blows a tire, and she pulls off to the side of the road. Robert Leroy Anderson pulled over, and she thought, oh, okay, well, this guy sees that I have a flat tire, and he's going to come help. She didn't think too much of it, but once she opened her trunk to get the spare tire out, and she saw him get out of his vehicle, she turned around and said, oh my God, you know, it's so great, thank you for helping me, but I think I can handle it. And Robert Leroy Anderson doesn't say a word. He walks up to her, and she starts to get that vibe that something is wrong here. Terrifyingly, he grabs her, middle of the day, and starts trying to pull her towards his vehicle. Luckily for her, her trunk was open. She said she was able to grab on to the lip of the trunk and pull herself forward, and as she did that, Robert Leroy Anderson fell backwards. She then took off running down the road where another car was coming towards her, and in a news report, she said that in her mind, she was hoping to God that they were not with Robert Leroy Anderson, and she had no idea who this man was at the time. But she ran towards his car, they stopped, and Robert Leroy Anderson got in his vehicle and left. She got away, and it's believed that if she had not gotten away, she would have been the first victim of the Robert Leroy Anderson murders. And it says here, on April 6th, 1999, a jury of 8 men and women found Anderson guilty on 4 counts: the rape and murder of Piper Streyle, the kidnapping and murder of Larisa Dumansky. 3 days later, Anderson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Robert Leroy Anderson never actually made it to the lethal injection because on March 30th, 2003, he committed suicide in his cell by hanging. Another thing that gets looked over quite often is what happened to Glenn Walker. Glenn Walker went to prison for quite a while. He got out on good behavior after, I believe it was 30 years, and I could be wrong on that. Earlier this month, February of 2024, he passed away. It's a sad case. This whole thing is ridiculously unnecessary. Families were devastated and destroyed. And honestly, and I don't get to say it very often, but the world is definitely a better place without those two in it. What they did to those women is unforgivable. It's truly a messed up case. I hope you guys enjoyed this one, the deep dive I did. I've been working on this one for a while, and I know I haven't put anything out there for a little bit. So I hope you enjoy this one, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.